Avoidant individuals operate under a system of internal logic that prioritizes distance as safety and closeness as threat. Within this system, reaching out requires overcoming a fundamental nervous system configuration designed to maintain separation rather than connection. Yet there are specific circumstances capable of disrupting this configuration so profoundly that avoidance becomes temporarily impossible, and contact, previously unthinkable, becomes the only available option the mind can tolerate. Understanding what creates these moments of forced contact requires examining the specific conditions that make silence more threatening than speech, and distance more costly than temporary closeness. Number 1. The first trigger operates through the experience of being replaced or made irrelevant within the psychological space one previously occupied. Avoidant individuals rarely contemplate their own replaceability during the relationship because ongoing access provides constant reassurance of continued importance, however unspoken that importance might be. The assumption of permanence built into the structure of ongoing closeness remains unexamined until that permanence is suddenly threatened. When the avoidant person discovers or suspects that someone else has filled their role, a different kind of alarm activates compared to the fear that originally drove them away. This is not the alarm of emotional demand or the threat of engulfment that typically triggers avoidant retreat. It is the alarm of erasure, of becoming truly unnecessary rather than merely distant. This discovery often arrives through indirect means. A mutual connection mentions someone new, a social circle shifts, or evidence suggests that life has continued and reorganized itself around an absence that should have been irreplaceable but somehow was not. The specific mechanism matters less than the internal recognition that the role one occupied has been filled by someone else. The response to this trigger is often swift and direct, because the stakes have shifted from internal comfort to external proof of continued importance. The avoidant person, driven by a need to restore their former position rather than by genuine closeness, reaches out with an intensity that can surprise both themselves and the person receiving contact. What makes this trigger potent is its operation at the intersection of identity and survival. The contact made under this trigger frequently carries subtle demonstrations of superiority over the replacement or efforts to reposition themselves as the original. Number 2. The second trigger centers on the breakdown of internal regulation systems that previously operated in the background of consciousness. Avoidant attachment includes sophisticated self-soothing mechanisms, routines that provide structure, and often a kind of controlled lifestyle designed to maintain emotional stability without requiring input from others. When external events force the collapse of these systems, the need for contact becomes functional rather than relational. A significant life disruption, a health crisis, a loss, or a major change can overwhelm the internal resources available for self-regulation. In these moments, the avoidant person discovers that their usual mechanisms for managing distress are insufficient. The isolation they normally prize becomes intolerable not because connection has become less threatening, but because the absence of support amplifies the discomfort past the point where internal resources alone can manage it. This trigger is distinct from emotional need in the traditional sense. The avoidant person is not reaching out for comfort in the way an anxious person might. They are reaching out because their system requires external support to function adequately, and they have exhausted the alternative options available to them. The contact made under this trigger often feels mechanical or task-oriented rather than emotionally intimate. Even when reaching out, the avoidant person may request specific help, practical assistance, or presence without the vulnerability that closeness usually requires. Yet the fact of contact itself represents a significant disruption to the avoidant pattern since the person has been forced to acknowledge their own dependence on outside resources. The temporary nature of this contact often surprises recipients. Once the crisis passes, the avoidant person often returns to distance rapidly, sometimes leaving the other person feeling abandoned again. Number 3. The third trigger emerges from competitive threat or the loss of status within their peer group or social position. Avoidant attachment intertwines with a need for autonomy and self-sufficiency, and this need extends into the social domain. Maintaining a particular image, a certain level of achievement, or a specific social standing becomes a substitute for emotional intimacy, providing a sense of worth that does not depend on relational validation. When someone who left the avoidant person's life achieves visible success, gains social prominence, or establishes themselves firmly within a shared social network, the threat to this substitute system activates. The avoidant person realizes they must reestablish their own standing, and sometimes the most efficient way to do this involves reconnecting with someone from their past in a way that suggests continued importance or relevance. This trigger often operates partially outside conscious awareness. The avoidant person may rationalize their contact as a genuine reconciliation attempt or frame it as random happenstance, not recognizing that the timing is directly related to a shift in social standing or competitive position. The contact itself may carry a subtle need to demonstrate that they have also moved forward, achieved or maintained status, sometimes more successfully than the other person. The behavior during contact often includes demonstrations of independence or success, a kind of subtle performance designed to restore the internal sense of hierarchical position. The avoidant person may drop contact again once this status has been re-established, since the underlying trigger was never about genuine connection but about restoring psychological equilibrium within a competitive framework. This trigger often leaves recipients confused, as contact carries simultaneously friendly and competitive undertones. The threat to status operates powerfully in avoidant psychology because it strikes at the alternative identity system that replaced emotional intimacy. Number 4. The fourth trigger operates through the specific architecture of guilt that avoidant attachment can generate when a person recognizes, often suddenly, that they caused significant harm to someone who did not deserve it. Unlike shame, which tends to drive further withdrawal in avoidant psychology, guilt creates a different kind of discomfort that contact can temporarily resolve. This recognition rarely arrives in real time, as discussed in earlier analysis of avoidant processing. It typically emerges later, often through comparison, through feedback from others, or through the person encountering patterns within themselves they cannot continue to rationalize. The moment of recognition is often intense precisely because it contradicts the narrative the avoidant person had constructed about their own behavior. The guilt, once triggered, becomes difficult to carry in isolation. The internal narrative that previously justified distance or coldness collapses under the weight of clearer understanding, leaving an emotional state the avoidant person cannot comfortably regulate alone. Contact becomes a mechanism for discharging this guilt, allowing the other person a chance to respond, and hopefully to offer reassurance that the harm, while real, has not destroyed the relationship irreparably. The contact made under this trigger often carries elements of indirect apology, re-establishment of connection, or subtle attempts to restore the relationship, without fully acknowledging what prompted the reconnection. The avoidant person may not consciously recognize that guilt is driving their behavior, instead attributing the contact to other causes, yet the guilt remains the underlying mechanism that made silence unbearable. The guilt that triggers contact is distinct from remorse. It is the experience of having caused harm that can no longer be rationalized away. This trigger produces potentially genuine reconnections, though guilt-driven contact often arrives too late. Number 5. Beyond the 4 primary triggers exists a secondary set of circumstances that can also force avoidant contact, though with less predictability and intensity. Ongoing evidence of the other person's well-being and continued positive functioning can paradoxically trigger contact from avoidant individuals, though this trigger operates on a longer timeline than the others discussed. When someone who left an avoidant person's life thrives, builds a healthy life, or achieves visible happiness without the avoidant person's presence, a peculiar dissonance can emerge. The avoidant narrative that the other person needed them, would struggle without them, or would eventually return tends to collapse when confronted with evidence of genuine flourishing. This trigger does not produce immediate contact but rather a slow accumulation of cognitive dissonance that eventually becomes uncomfortable enough to require action. The action may take the form of reconnection, a curious question about the other person's life, or a seemingly random message that reinstates contact under the guise of casual conversation. The avoidant person may frame contact as genuine interest without recognizing it emerges from cognitive dissonance. Contact under this trigger develops slowly, requiring sustained exposure to evidence of the other person's thriving. Number 6. Personal growth and increased self-awareness within the avoidant person can also function as a trigger, though this remains less common than the others. As an avoidant individual gains insight into their own patterns through therapy, life experience, or significant relationships that challenge their existing framework, the previous justifications for distance become less tenable. This growth often feels uncomfortable, creating an internal pressure to address past patterns and people who were affected by them. The avoidant person may reach out not primarily for the benefit of the person they contact, but because maintaining complete distance becomes inconsistent with their emerging understanding of their own responsibility and impact. Growth-driven contact is often the most genuine form of reconnection avoidant individuals initiate, since it originates from internal shift rather than external threat or need. Yet avoidant individuals often underestimate how much time has passed or how much impact their patterns had, occasionally reaching out to people who have already moved beyond the stage where such reconnection holds relevance. Therapy or meaningful relationships that challenge avoidant patterns can activate this trigger by creating a mirror that makes the previous behavior undeniable. When confronted with how their patterns have affected others or when exposed to models of healthier relating, some avoidant people find themselves compelled to address past relationships. This trigger is relatively uncommon since it requires both growth opportunity and willingness to engage with uncomfortable self-awareness. Number 7. The phenomenon of unresolved attachment to the specific person as distinct from general anxious attachment patterns can also produce contact attempts that appear contradictory to avoidant psychology. Some avoidant individuals maintain, despite their efforts to distance themselves, a singular attachment to a particular person that resists their normal detachment mechanisms. This attachment often remains unexamined and unacknowledged, operating beneath layers of rationalization and denial. Yet in moments when the avoidant person encounters situations that activate this attachment, the usual defenses fail and contact becomes an almost involuntary response. Such contact is often confused, tentative, and frequently abandoned quickly once the avoidant person recognizes what has been triggered. The avoidant person may withdraw again almost immediately after reaching out, creating a pattern of sudden contact followed by renewed distance that mirrors their internal conflict between attachment and avoidance. This attachment often exists outside explicit awareness as an unconscious exception to the general avoidance pattern. Contact under this trigger is particularly painful, appearing to signal genuine reconnection before dissolving just as suddenly. Number 8. Isolation, when it extends beyond the avoidant person's comfort threshold, can also force contact despite the avoidant preference for solitude. There exists a particular level of aloneness that even avoidant individuals find unbearable, and when this level is approached or exceeded, contact becomes necessary for psychological survival rather than relational preference. This differs from the breakdown of regulation systems mentioned earlier in that it concerns the total absence of any connection, however minimal or distant. The avoidant person may have successfully severed contact, may have built a life of genuine solitude, but still encounter moments where the total absence of any relational connection becomes intolerable. Contact made under this trigger often sounds different from contact made under others, carrying sometimes desperate or unusually vulnerable undertones that the avoidant person typically suppresses. The persona of independence often cracks during these moments, revealing the vulnerability beneath. Isolation tolerance varies among avoidant individuals. Once a threshold is crossed, the avoidant person may reach out to almost anyone available. The contact seeks simple availability rather than specific connection. Number 9. The death of other options, or the recognition that alternative sources of connection have become unavailable, can force contact as a final option when all others have been exhausted. An avoidant person who has built their social life on shallow connections, professional relationships, or situational friendships may find these sources drying up as life circumstances change. When friends move away, relationships dissolve, or the circumstances that created particular connections no longer exist. The avoidant person may be left with fewer options than they had anticipated. In such situations, reconnecting with someone from the past, even someone they distanced themselves from, may represent a pragmatic choice rather than an emotional one. This trigger produces contact that often carries little emotional content, operating as a matter of practical necessity rather than relational desire. The avoidant person may reconnect simply because the person remains in their available network, even as they maintain emotional distance. The death of options forces avoidant individuals to acknowledge dependencies previously denied. Someone receiving contact motivated by death of options experiences pain, recognizing they are a final option rather than a chosen one. Number 10. Comparison with new relationships, particularly when new connections fail to replicate the depth, understanding, or ease that existed with the person they left, can also trigger contact. The avoidant person may not initially recognize that their new relationships feel shallower, but over time, the absence of the specific ease that existed previously becomes noticeable. This recognition often produces a desire to reconnect, not necessarily because the avoidant person wants to return to the relationship, but because they wish to understand why that particular connection felt different. The contact made under this trigger often carries subtle attempts to recreate or understand what made the previous relationship distinct. The comparison may take years to develop as new relationships seem adequate until specific qualities become noticeably absent. Contact under this trigger carries a searching quality, seeking confirmation that what existed was real. Understanding the common element. Across all of these triggers exists a common element. They all involve a disruption to the avoidant person's internal equilibrium that cannot be resolved through their usual mechanisms of distance and self-regulation. Contact is not chosen but rather forced, by circumstances external or internal that have become impossible to ignore. This distinction matters because it clarifies that avoidant individuals do not reach out when they have processed their emotions, gained insight, or decided that reconnection is worthwhile. They reach out when the cost of silence has exceeded the cost of speech, when distance has become more threatening than closeness, or when their usual systems have collapsed. The pressure created by trigger activation is not voluntary or easily controlled. The avoidant person may recognize what is happening and attempt to suppress the impulse to contact, yet the pressure continues to build. Contact becomes a relief of psychological pressure rather than a choice made freely. This coercive quality distinguishes trigger-driven contact from contact emerging from genuine relational intention. The avoidant person may not want to reach out, yet pressure has become sufficient to override their preference for distance. The timing and unpredictability of triggers. One of the most frustrating aspects of avoidant contact triggers is their fundamental unpredictability from an external perspective. Someone waiting for an avoidant person to reach out cannot reliably know which trigger might activate, when it might activate, or whether the person will suppress the impulse entirely. An avoidant person may avoid contact for years, then reconnect suddenly because of a social threat, a guilt realization, or a collapse in their isolation tolerance. Someone else might never trigger any of these mechanisms, leaving the avoidant person content in permanent distance. The person being avoided often bears the discomfort of this unpredictability, left uncertain whether continued patience might eventually produce contact or whether silence has become final. Avoidant psychology offers no reliable answer to this question, since the answer depends entirely on which specific circumstances might activate which specific trigger. Someone observing cannot know which triggers exist for a particular avoidant person, what threshold might activate each trigger, or whether any trigger will be sufficiently activated to force contact. This opacity is inherent to avoidant psychology, since many triggers operate outside conscious awareness. Waiting for contact from an avoidant person means waiting for forces entirely beyond one's own control. It means hoping life circumstances will shift in ways that create pressure the avoidant person cannot ignore, though this hope may never be fulfilled. Contact under duress versus genuine connection. Contact forced by these triggers is qualitatively different from contact that emerges from genuine desire for reconnection or relational growth. The avoidant person may reach out, but their underlying motivation remains rooted in the trigger itself rather than in authentic desire for the other person. This distinction affects how such contact typically unfolds. The avoidant person may engage briefly, seemingly with warmth or interest, then withdraw again once the trigger has been satisfied, or once they recognize that contact is reactivating their avoidance defenses. Understanding that contact is trigger-driven rather than desire-driven helps contextualize why reconnections often feel hollow, unresolved, or ultimately disappointing to the person on the receiving end. The avoidant person has not suddenly overcome their avoidant attachment through the simple act of reaching out. They have merely bent temporarily to circumstances that made avoidance impossible. The person receiving such contact may find themselves hopeful that this reconnection signals a genuine shift, that the avoidant person has finally recognized what was lost. This hope is frequently disappointed when the avoidant person withdraws again, once the underlying trigger has been satisfied. The pattern of hope followed by renewed abandonment can be more damaging than consistent distance would have been, since it reintroduces vulnerability and attachment precisely when the avoidant person is least capable of sustaining genuine connection. Why some triggers work better than others. Certain triggers produce more sustainable contact than others, generally those that have forced genuine internal shifts rather than temporary external accommodations. Guilt-based contact, growth-based contact, and contact driven by unresolved attachment tend to be more durable, since they involve some level of internal processing rather than pure circumstantial pressure. Status threat, replacement, or competitive pressure may produce rapid contact but often generates equally rapid withdrawal once the threat has been addressed. The avoidant person may reconnect long enough to re-establish their position, then distance again once that goal has been achieved. The most sustainable contact often emerges when multiple triggers activate simultaneously, creating a complex circumstance that cannot be resolved through simple withdrawal or temporary accommodation. In such situations, the avoidant person may remain engaged long enough for genuine reconnection to begin, though this remains relatively rare. Guilt combined with isolation or status threat combined with unresolved attachment can create overlapping pressures that make simple distance maintenance impossible. When multiple systems are activated, the avoidant person may find themselves remaining in contact, not because any single trigger is fully satisfied, but because multiple triggers continue to create pressure. These compound activations are less common than single trigger events, yet they produce the most meaningful reconnections, since the avoidant person remains engaged long enough for some genuine relational work to occur. The distinction between contact and reconnection. Contact and reconnection are not identical phenomena, and avoidant psychology often confuses the two. A person may reach out, initiate contact, and engage temporarily without ever genuinely reconnecting on a relational level. Reconnection would imply some level of internal shift, a renegotiation of the relationship, or a genuine engagement with what distance had damaged. Contact, by contrast, may be entirely superficial, a brief re-establishment of the connection followed by renewed distance once the underlying trigger has been addressed. Many people wait in hope that contact will eventually lead to reconnection, not recognizing that trigger-driven contact often serves the opposite function, temporarily relieving internal pressure so the avoidant person can return more comfortably to distance. The avoidant person may experience the contact they make as a form of resolution, a closing of an unfinished chapter that allows them to move forward. They may feel they have done what was necessary, addressed what needed addressing, and can now withdraw with less internal pressure than before. This experience of closure on the avoidant person's part often contradicts the experience of the person receiving contact, who may feel that reconnection has just begun rather than been resolved. This asynchrony between the two perspectives often ensures that genuine reconnection fails to develop. The role of circumstances beyond individual psychology. The activation of avoidant triggers often depends heavily on circumstances that have nothing to do with the avoidant person's emotional processes or their capacity for growth. Random life events, coincidental encounters, or the achievements of third parties can activate triggers that internal motivation never would. This means that reconnection with an avoidant person is often more dependent on external circumstances than on internal readiness. An avoidant person may be capable of genuine connection but never reach out because no trigger activates. Conversely, someone with less emotional capacity may reach out repeatedly because their circumstances consistently trigger reconnection attempts. This reality is difficult to accept for people waiting for avoidant partners or friends, since it suggests that patience and personal growth are insufficient to ensure contact. Ultimately, whether and when an avoidant person reaches out depends largely on what happens in their external world, not on what happens in their heart. The waiting person has no ability to activate these triggers directly. They cannot force replacement, cannot manufacture guilt, cannot create the specific life circumstances that would activate contact. They can only wait passively for external events to unfold in ways that might or might not occur. This powerlessness is perhaps the most difficult aspect of waiting for contact from an avoidant person. The person waiting has no mechanism through which to influence the outcome, no way to accelerate the timeline, no certainty that any amount of patience will ever result in the contact they seek. Fate and circumstance become the primary determinants of reconnection, removing most of the variables the waiting person might otherwise control. Conclusion. Avoidant individuals do not reach out because they have overcome their avoidance or because they have recognized the value of connection. They reach out when specific circumstances create disruptions to their internal equilibrium that their usual coping mechanisms cannot manage. Replacement, system collapse, status threat, guilt realization, isolation, and other triggers force contact not as a choice but as a necessity, a pressure so intense that silence becomes impossible to maintain. Understanding this framework recontextualizes what it means when an avoidant person does reach out. The contact does not signal transformation or willingness to change. It signals that something in their world has shifted enough to make distance temporarily untenable. Contact under these conditions is a symptom of disruption, not evidence of growth, and often provides the avoidant person a temporary release that allows them to return to distance with renewed commitment. The triggers that force avoidant contact remain largely outside the control of the person being avoided. Whether contact occurs, when it occurs, and what form it takes depend on circumstances that may never align. Waiting for an avoidant person to reach out is ultimately waiting for forces beyond relational control to activate pressures the avoidant person cannot ignore. Contact, when it comes, often disappoints rather than restores, since it emerges from pressure rather than genuine desire to reconnect. The avoidant person reaches out to relieve their own discomfort, not because they have suddenly recognized the other person's value or developed new capacity for intimacy. For those waiting for contact from an avoidant individual, the most realistic approach involves acknowledging that reconnection depends on circumstances largely beyond anyone's control. Avoidant psychology offers no guarantees and few mechanisms for reliably producing contact. It offers only the understanding that contact comes because something in the avoidant person's world has shifted enough to make silence unbearable, a shift that may never occur regardless of patience or understanding displayed.